Welcome to Relative Our Family Mess. This is a dedicated space where we explore the deeper dimensions of life, focusing on true strength, timeless resilience, and the compelling stories that shape a man's journey. If you appreciate substantive, impactful content and refined perspectives, you are in the right place. Without further ado, I welcome you to today's new video. My name is Frank Holloway. I am 70 years old. I have farmed 800 acres of Iowa soil for 52 years. The same land my great-grandfather broke with a team of mules in 1891. And on the morning of September the 7th, while the sun was still climbing over the silos and the dew had not yet burned off the soybean rows, I found a FedEx envelope on my porch that would end my son's marriage, put my daughter-in-law in handcuffs, and force me to rewrite my will before Thanksgiving dinner. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest. I am not a vengeful man. I have buried a wife. I have buried 2 brothers. I have watched corn freeze in October and watched hogs die of blue ear. And I have never raised my voice in anger to a living soul. But what my son Ethan did to me, and what his wife Vanessa pulled him into, was not the kind of wound a man forgives over coffee and a handshake. It was the kind of wound that makes you sit down at the kitchen table at 4 in the morning and decide, very quietly, that the harvest this year will be different. If you have ever given your life to something, a farm, a business, a trade, a child, and watched someone you raised try to take it from you with a smile and a forged signature, do me a favor. Stay with me until the end of this story. Because what I'm about to tell you is not just about a farm in Iowa. It's about what a man owes the land that fed him, and what he owes the children who forgot where their last name came from. That morning started the way every September morning has started for me since 1973. I came down the stairs at 4:40. I put the coffee on. I pulled my boots over my socks at the back door, the same pair of Red Wings I've worn for 9 years. Resoled twice. I let the dog out, a border collie named Cap, 14 years old, half deaf, still the best worker on the property, and I walked out onto the porch to watch the sun come up over the north field. That's when I saw it, a white FedEx envelope leaning against the porch post, addressed to Mr. Franklin J. Holloway, Holloway Farms, Route 4, Cedar Hollow, Iowa. The sender's line read, Whitfield, Crane and Associates, Attorneys at Law, Des Moines. I did not recognize the law firm. I have a lawyer. His name is Tom Brennan. He's been my lawyer for 31 years, and his office is 14 miles down County Road B, above the hardware store. He does not work for Whitfield, Crane and Associates. He does not work for anyone in Des Moines. I picked up the envelope. I carried it inside. I set it on the kitchen table next to the coffee pot, and I sat down and stared at it for a long time before I opened it. You learned things on a farm about waiting. You learn that a seed in cold ground will not sprout, no matter how much you pray over it. You learn that a calf turned the wrong way in the womb has to be turned slow, or you'll lose the cow and the calf both. And you learn that a piece of paper sitting on your kitchen table at 5 in the morning, sent by a law firm you have never heard of, is not something you open in a hurry. You drink your coffee first. You let the sun come up, and you ask yourself, before you tear the seal, what kind of man sent this? And what kind of man does he think I am? I drank my coffee. I watched the light hit the top of the grain bin through the kitchen window. And then I slid my thumb under the flap and pulled out 3 documents. The first was a copy of a last will and testament, dated August the 19th of this year. My signature was at the bottom. The signature was a good forgery, close enough to fool the bank. Maybe even close enough to fool Tom Brennan if he didn't look twice. But I knew it wasn't mine because I had never signed it. The second was a 50-year agricultural lease. Lessor Franklin J. Holloway. Lessee Cromwell Agri-Industrial Holdings. Limited. Annual rate $41 per acre. The county average for tillable Iowa ground that year was 280. The third was a notarized physician's letter, signed by a doctor I had never met, stating that the patient, me, was in the early stages of cognitive decline and was no longer competent to manage his own financial affairs. I read all 3 documents twice. I folded them back into the envelope. I picked up the phone on the wall, the one with the cord, and I dialed a number I had not dialed in 11 years. A woman answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was older than I remembered, but steady, judicial. The voice of someone who had spent 40 years asking hard questions in a quiet room. "Ruth," I said. "It's Frank Holloway. I need your help. And I need you to come out to the farm before my son finds out I called you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Judge Ruth Calloway said 4 words. "I'll be there by noon. Ruth Calloway and I have a history that does not belong in this story, except for one piece of it. In 1994, when my wife Margaret was dying of ovarian cancer, Ruth was the family court judge who signed the emergency guardianship papers that let Margaret's sister fly in from Oregon to help us with the children for the last 6 weeks. Ruth drove out to the farm herself on a Sunday with the paperwork in a manila folder because she knew Margaret could not sit up long enough to get to the courthouse. She drank coffee at this same kitchen table. She held Margaret's hand. And before she left, she told me that if I ever needed her, for anything, I was to call her directly and not go through a clerk. I had not called her in 11 years. I was calling her now. While I waited for her to make the drive from Des Moines, I did what any farmer does when something is broken. I started taking it apart, piece by piece, to see what I was dealing with. I spread the 3 documents across the kitchen table. I put my reading glasses on, and I went through them line by line, the way I go through a seed contract in February. The will was the cleverest of the 3. It was dated August 19th, a Tuesday. On that Tuesday, I had been at the Cedar Hollow Co-op all afternoon, signing for a delivery of anhydrous ammonia, and there were 6 men who could swear to it. The will gave 95% of Holloway Farms the house, the 800 acres, the equipment, the grain bins, the cattle to my son Ethan James. Holloway of Manhattan, New York, it gave 5% to my daughter Hannah. It made no mention of the family cemetery on the North Ridge, where my parents and my wife are buried, which by Iowa law would have transferred with the land. The signature at the bottom was close. The loop on the F was right. The slant on the H was wrong. Whoever forged it had studied a check. Maybe, but had never watched me sign in person. I signed slow. I sign with my whole hand, not just my fingers. The forgery was a finger signature. A man's signature. But not mine. The lease was uglier. 50 years at $41 an acre meant Holloway Farms would generate $32,800 a year. In rent, less than what one good harvest of soybeans on 100 acres brings in. Cromwell Agri-Industrial Holdings would hold the land at that price until the year 2075. By then, I would have been dead for decades. Hannah would be in her 70s. And whatever was left of the Holloway name would be a footnote on a corporate balance sheet in some glass tower in Chicago. The doctor's letter was the most insulting. It was signed by a doctor, Marcus Feldman, of a private geriatric assessment clinic in West Des Moines. According to Dr. Feldman, he had personally examined the patient on July the 22nd and found moderate impairment of executive function, consistent with early-stage neurodegenerative decline. On July the 22nd, I had been baling second-cut alfalfa from sunrise until 9 at night. I had not been within 60 miles of West Des Moines. I had not been examined by a doctor since my Medicare physical in March. Which doctor? Sarah Linden of Cedar Hollow Family Practice had signed off on with the note, "Patient in excellent health for age. Cognition intact. Recommend continued physical activity." 3 lies, 3 documents, 1 son. I sat back in my chair and I looked at the documents, and I waited to feel angry. I waited a long time. The anger did not come. What came instead was a memory I had not let myself touch in 36 years. It was February of 1989. Ethan was 4 years old. He had a cough that started on a Wednesday and turned into pneumonia by Friday night. Margaret was driving back from her mother's in Davenport in a sleet storm and would not be home until midnight. The nearest hospital was 41 miles away, in Cedar Rapids. The truck would not start. The temperature outside was 11 below zero. I wrapped that boy in 3 blankets and a quilt my grandmother had stitched in 1946. I carried him out to the tractor, the old John Deere 402, the one with the enclosed cab and the heater that actually worked, and I drove him 41 miles down County Road B at 15 miles an hour in a sleet storm, with my hand on his chest the whole way, feeling for his breathing. We got to the emergency room at 2:15 in the morning. The doctor said another 2 hours, and we would have lost him. I sat in the waiting room until sunrise, in my coveralls, smelling of diesel, and I prayed the only honest prayer I have ever prayed in my life. I said, "Lord, take the farm, take the land, take everything I have. Just let me keep the boy." The Lord let me keep the boy, and now the boy was trying to take the farm. The phone on the wall rang at 11:52. It was not Ruth, it was Ethan. "Dad," he said, in the warm voice he uses when he wants something. "I'm flying into Cedar Rapids tonight. Vanessa and I want to come out to the farm tomorrow morning. We need to talk about your future." I looked at the 3 documents on the kitchen table. "Son," I said, "I think we do." Ruth Calloway arrived at 11:58, 6 minutes after I hung up the phone with my son. She drove a 15-year-old Buick LeSabre, dark green, the same car she had driven the last time she came to this farm. She was 74 years old now, retired from the bench for 3 years, and she walked up the porch steps the way she had always walked into a courtroom, slow, deliberate, and without apology for taking up the space she took up. She did not embrace me. We are not embracing people. She looked at me for a long moment on the porch, and she said, "Show me." I led her to the kitchen table. She sat down in the same chair Margaret used to sit in, and she put on a pair of reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck, and she read the 3 documents in silence for 11 minutes by the clock on the stove. When she finished, she removed her glasses. She folded them. She placed them on the table next to the will, and she said the first thing she had said in almost a quarter of an hour. "Frank, this is not a family dispute. This is a felony." I had already known that. But there is a difference between a thing you know in your kitchen at 6 in the morning and a thing a retired district court judge says to you out loud at noon. The second one makes the floor feel a little harder under your boots. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Time," I said, "and quiet. Ethan is flying in tonight. He'll be here tomorrow morning. I don't want him to know I've seen any of this. Not yet." She nodded once. She did not ask me why. Ruth has never in her life asked a man why he wants to wait before he swings. She understood waiting. You'll need a forensic accountant, she said. Someone independent, not local. I figured. You'll need a neurologist on record. A real one. Mayo, if we can get them. I figured that too. And you'll need a copy of your real will. The one Tom Brennan keeps in his safe. Because when this goes in front of a judge, the first thing they're going to ask is what document this fraudulent one is trying to replace. I had not thought of that. I told her so. She almost smiled. That's why you called me, Frank. She left at 12:45 with copies of all 3 documents in a sealed envelope, headed back to Des Moines to make some phone calls she did not want to make from my kitchen. Before she pulled out of the drive, she rolled down the window of the Buick and looked at me through it. Frank, one thing. Yes, ma'am. When your boy comes here tomorrow, you smile at him. You hug his wife. You offer them coffee. You ask about their flight. Do you understand me? I understand. A man who has decided to act, she said, does not warn the thing he is about to act against. She drove away, and I went to town. Daisy's Diner sits on the corner of Main and 2nd Street in Cedar Hollow, in a building that was a hardware store in 1922, and has been a diner since the year I was born. I have eaten lunch there 3 days a week for 51 years. The waitress is named Carla. She is 63. Her mother was named Daisy, and Daisy waited on my father in that same diner in 1955. I went to Daisy's that afternoon because I needed to be seen. I needed Cedar Hollow to see Frank Holloway walk in the door, hang his hat on the hook by the register, sit at the counter, order the meatloaf special with mashed potatoes and green beans, and pay with a 20 out of a money clip he had carried since 1978. I needed the town to remember, before whatever happened next, that I was still the man they had always known. Carla brought my coffee without asking. She set the cup down. She did not pour. She leaned across the counter closer than she had ever leaned in 51 years, and she spoke quietly enough that the trucker 2 stools down could not hear. Frank, I need to tell you something. I waited. Your boy was in here 3 weeks ago, a Thursday. He had lunch with Pastor Walsh. I kept my face still. I've been keeping my face still on a farm for 70 years. A farmer who shows what he feels loses the negotiation before it starts. They sat in the back booth, Carla said. The one by the bathrooms. They were here 2.5 hours. They had coffee. They had pie. They did not order food. And before they left, your boy gave Pastor Walsh an envelope, a thick one. Walsh put it inside his Bible and walked out the front door. She finally poured the coffee. Her hand was steady, but she did not look at me. I wasn't going to say anything. Frank, it's not my business. But Walsh has been telling people at church that you've been forgetting things. That you left the tractor running in the south field for 2 days last month. That you couldn't remember Hannah's birthday. I set the money clip on the counter. Carla, yes, Frank. Did I leave the tractor running for 2 days last month? She finally looked at me. No, Frank, you didn't. I did not sleep much that Saturday night. I lay in the bed Margaret and I had shared for 38 years, and I stared at the ceiling. And I worked through what Carla had told me, the way a man works through a row of corn with a hoe, one weed at a time. No skipping, no hurrying. Pastor David Walsh had been the minister at First Faith Methodist for 19 years. He had buried Margaret. He had baptized Hannah. He had eaten Thanksgiving dinner at this farm 7 times. He had borrowed my grain truck in 2011 to move his daughter to college in Ames. And he had returned it with a full tank of diesel and a thank you note written by hand. I had given that church $47,000 in 18 years. Some of it for the roof. Some of it for the food pantry. Some of it because David had looked me in the eye one Sunday after service and told me a young family in the next county was about to lose their farm. And I had written a check that night and asked him to deliver it without my name on it. And 3 weeks ago, in the back booth at Daisy's Diner, that same man had taken an envelope from my son and put it inside his Bible. I do not have language for what that did to me. I am a farmer. I have language for weather, and language for soil, and language for grief. I do not have language for the particular kind of cold that settles in a man's chest when he learns that a pastor he has fed at his own table has been paid to tell the town he is losing his mind. What I had instead of language was a decision. I was going to church in the morning. First Faith Methodist sits on a small rise on the east edge of Cedar Hollow, a white clapboard building with a steeple that has needed paint since 2019. The bell in that steeple was cast in 1894 and donated by my great-grandfather, Josiah Holloway, the same man who broke this ground with mules. His name is on a brass plate inside the vestibule. I have walked past that plate every Sunday of my adult life. I arrived at 10:20 for the 10:30 service. I parked the truck where I always park it, under the oak tree on the south side of the lot. I walked up the front steps with my hat in my hand. I shook hands with Earl Pettigrew, who has been the head usher since 1996. I sat in the fourth pew on the left, on the aisle, in the seat that has been my seat for half a century, and I watched the congregation watch me. It was a small thing. A farmer would not have noticed it. A city man would not have noticed it. But a man who has sat in the same pew for 50 years notices when Marge Henderson, 2 pews up, turns her head a quarter inch to whisper to her sister. He notices when young Tyler Brennan Tom's grandson, 26 years old, raised in this church, gives him a look of pity that no 26-year-old should ever give a 70-year-old. He notices when Earl Pettigrew, shaking his hand at the door, holds his hand a half-second too long and asks, "How you doing?" "Frank." "You doing all right out there alone?" 3 weeks. 3 weeks of whispers from a pulpit. And half the town I had built was looking at me like a man at his own funeral. Pastor Walsh climbed into the pulpit at 10:32. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, soft-handed, with a voice that had been trained at a seminary in Tennessee to sound exactly like comfort. He looked out across the congregation. He saw me in the fourth pew, and for just a moment less than a second, no longer than the click of a stopwatch, his face changed. It was not guilt. I want to be clear about that. A guilty man would have been easier. What crossed David Walsh's face when he saw me sitting in my pew, on my Sunday, in the church my great-grandfather had paid for, was calculation. The look of a man revising a sermon in his head because the wrong listener had walked in. He recovered. He smiled. He opened with a joke about the Hawkeyes losing to Iowa State. The congregation laughed, and then he turned to the scripture. He had chosen, that morning, the parable of the rich fool from the 12th chapter of Luke, the story of a man who tears down his barns to build bigger ones, who hoards his harvest, who tells his soul to eat, drink, and be merry, and whom God calls a fool that very night, because his soul is required of him. And the question is asked, who shall those things be, which thou hast provided? He preached on it for 26 minutes. He never said my name. He did not have to. He spoke about elderly farmers who clung too tightly to land they could no longer work. He spoke about the burden a parent places on his children when he refuses to let go. He spoke about wisdom, the wisdom to know when the harvest is no longer yours. He spoke about pride disguised as legacy. And at the 11-minute mark, he looked directly at the fourth pew, on the left, on the aisle. And he said the sentence I had come to hear, brothers and sisters, There comes a time when a man must trust his children with what God has trusted to him. There comes a time when holding on becomes a kind of theft from the next generation. I sat very still after the service in the fellowship hall, over weak coffee in a paper cup. Pastor David Walsh worked his way across the room toward me with the slow, smiling confidence of a man who believed he had just done a hard day's work. He put his hand on my shoulder. "Frank," he said, "have you got a minute? I'd love to talk." I smiled at him the way Ruth Calloway had told me to smile. "David," I said, "I've got all the time in the world." Pastor Walsh suggested his office. I suggested the cemetery behind the church. He blinked at me over his paper cup. "The cemetery. Frank, it's a nice morning. David, and Margaret's out there. I like to visit when I come." He could not say no to that. A pastor who refuses to walk a widower to his wife's grave on a Sunday morning is a pastor who has stopped pretending. So he set down his coffee, and he picked up his Bible, the same Bible Carla had watched him slide an envelope into 3 weeks earlier, and he followed me out the side door of the fellowship hall. The cemetery at First Faith is small, fewer than 200 stones. The oldest ones, from the 1870s, lean a little to the east now, the way old stones do in Iowa wind. Margaret's stone is in the 3rd row from the back. Under a maple tree, I planted myself the spring after she died. The stone reads, Margaret Ann Holloway, 1948 to 1994. Beloved wife and mother. There is a blank space beneath her name, the size and shape of mine. I stopped in front of the stone. I took off my hat. Pastor Walsh stopped 2 paces behind me and folded his hands over the Bible in a posture of practiced reverence. I did not turn around. "David," I said, "how long have you known my son, Ethan?" A pause. Half a second too long. "Well, Frank, since he was a boy. I baptized Hannah. You'll remember. I was here when Ethan was confirmed. Of course, we lost touch after he moved to New York. When did you last see him?" Another pause. "Longer. Christmas, I believe. The year before last. He came home for the holiday and attended the late service. I let that sit in the air between us for a count of 5. Then I turned around. David, there is a woman who has waited on my coffee in this town for 51 years. She saw you have lunch with my son in the back booth at Daisy's 3 Thursdays ago. She watched my son hand you an envelope. She watched you put that envelope inside the Bible you are holding right now. I want you to think very carefully about the next sentence that comes out of your mouth, because that woman has no reason to lie to me, and a great deal of evidence that you do." His face did 3 things in succession. First it went still. Then it went pale. Then it tried. Very briefly. To find the expression of wounded dignity it had spent 30 years cultivating for moments, exactly like this one. He did not find it. What he found instead was a sentence I have heard from 100 men over 50 years of doing business in Cedar Hollow. The sentence a man speaks when he has been caught and is buying time to figure out how much the other man knows. "Frank, it isn't what you think." "David," I said, "I have not told you what I think." He opened his mouth. He closed it. A crow called from the top of the maple tree above Margaret's grave. The wind moved through the corn in the field beyond the cemetery fence, and the sound it made was the sound it has made on this ground for 134 years. I waited. "Your son," he finally said, "is concerned about you. Frank. He came to me as his pastor. He told me you had been forgetting things. He asked me to gently begin preparing the congregation for a transition, so that when the time came, the community would support the family and the envelope. A donation to the building fund. How much?" He looked at the stones. He looked at the Bible. He looked at me. Frank, I really don't see. David, how much? The number, when it came, was so small I almost laughed. I would have laughed. Except a man does not laugh in front of his wife's grave. $12,000. $12,000. 18 years of my tithing was $47,000. My son had bought this man, and the pulpit, my great-grandfather's bell, sat above. For roughly 1/4 of what I had given the same church to keep its roof from leaking. I have known cheaper men. I have not known many. I put my hat back on. I straightened it. And I asked him the question I had walked to the cemetery to ask. David, did you know the documents were forged? He went very still. That stillness is the only honest thing Pastor David Walsh did that morning. Because a man who did not know about forged documents does not go still at the word forged. A man who did not know would have said what documents. He would have asked. He would have been confused. David Walsh was not confused. He whispered it. I did not see any documents. Frank, I swear to God. But you knew there were documents. He did not answer. I stepped closer to him. Not threatening. I have never raised a hand to a man in my life, and I was not going to start in a graveyard. I stepped closer because I wanted him to hear the next thing I said, the way Margaret used to hear me when I sat on the edge of the bed in the last weeks, and told her she did not have to be afraid. David, I am going to tell you something, and I want you to carry it with you for the rest of your ministry. My great-grandfather paid for the bell in that steeple. My grandfather paid for the pews you preached from this morning. My father paid for the parking lot. I paid for the roof over your head, and the furnace under your feet, and the salary that fed your daughter through college. And you sold the pulpit they built to a man who has not set foot on his own father's land in 4 years. For $12,000. I started walking back toward the truck. Halfway to the gate, I stopped and turned around. David, one more thing. Next Sunday's sermon, I want you to preach on Judas. Chapter 26 of Matthew, the 30 pieces of silver. And I want you to look at the 4th pew, on the left, on the aisle. When you preach it, I did not wait for an answer. I drove home. Ethan's rental car was already in my drive. The car in my drive was a black Cadillac Escalade with New York plates and a rental sticker on the rear bumper. Ethan was leaning against the driver's door with his phone to his ear. Vanessa was already on my porch. She had her hand on the screen door. Vanessa Holloway is 38 years old. She is the daughter of a Connecticut hedge fund manager. And she has the kind of beauty a woman pays for in small installments, over a decade. Straight teeth, straight hair, straight posture. Nothing on her face that has ever been surprised by weather. That morning she was wearing white slacks and a cream-colored blouse and a pair of leather flats that had never touched a pasture. She turned when she heard my truck door close, and she smiled the smile she had practiced in a mirror somewhere in Manhattan. Frank, there you are. We were starting to worry. I did not answer her. I walked past the Escalade. Ethan ended his phone call and pushed off the door. Dad, sorry to just drop in like this. The flight got in early. You said tomorrow morning? I know. Vanessa wanted to beat the traffic out of Cedar Rapids, and Vanessa, I said, without looking at her, is standing on my porch, with her hand on a door she has not been invited through. The porch went quiet. She took her hand off the screen door. She did it slowly, the way a person sets down a knife when somebody has walked into the kitchen unexpectedly. Frank, she said. I didn't mean. Come down off the porch, please. She came down. We stood in the yard, the 3 of us, in a triangle of about 10 feet. The dog Cap had come around from the barn and was sitting by my left boot. He did not growl. Cap has never growled at a human in his 14 years. But he was sitting very straight and his ears were forward, and Ethan noticed. "Dad, we came out here because we love you. That's all." "All right. We've been worried about the farm, about how much you're carrying alone out here." "All right." He waited for me to say more. I did not say more. The silence stretched, and I watched my son's face work through 3 expressions: concern, patience, and a small flicker of something underneath that he had not meant to let me see. Irritation. The irritation of a man whose script is not getting the responses it was written for. Vanessa stepped in. "Frank, what Ethan is trying to say, we want to help. We've been talking to some people, advisors, about succession planning, about how families like ours can structure things, so that the land stays in the family, and the next generation can—" "Vanessa." "Yes, Frank." "Whose advisors?" A half-second pause. "The same half-second Walsh had given me in the cemetery?" "Ours. Mine and Ethan's. People we trust. Out of New York. Some, yes. Have any of them been in this country longer than my grain bin?" Ethan stepped forward. "Dad, come on. That's not fair." "Son, I asked your wife a question. I'd like her to answer it. She did not answer it. I looked at my boy then. Really looked at him. He was 40 years old. He was wearing a quarter-zip pullover that cost more than a heifer. His hair was thinning at the crown the way mine had thinned at his age, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there at Christmas the year before last, and underneath all of it was still the 4-year-old boy I had carried 41 miles in a sleet storm on the seat of a John Deere 4020. I almost broke. Standing there, I want to be honest about that. For about 2 seconds, looking at my son in my yard, I almost said, "Get in the house and let's start over." Then I remembered the signature on the will. The slant on the akich. "Ethan." "Yes, Dad. Tomorrow morning. 7 o'clock. Just you. Not Vanessa. You come to the kitchen and you sit at the table and we have a conversation. Man to man. About my future. About yours. About this farm." His face brightened. He thought he had won something. "Of course, Dad. Whatever you want." "And Ethan." "Yes. Bring the documents." His face did not change. To his credit, he had been trained somewhere, maybe by Vanessa, maybe by whoever Vanessa had introduced him to keep his face still when a sentence landed wrong. But his hand moved. His right hand, hanging at his side, twitched, once toward the pocket of his pullover. The pocket where a man keeps his phone. The pocket where a man reaches when he wants to text somebody very quickly that the situation has changed. He caught the hand. He held it still. "What documents, Dad?" I smiled at him the way Ruth Calloway had told me to smile. "You'll know," I said. 7 o'clock. The Escalade pulled out of my drive at 4:18 that afternoon. I watched the dust settle on the gravel for a long minute after the taillights disappeared. Then I went inside, and I called Ruth Calloway, and I told her I needed her back at the farm by sundown, and I needed her to bring 2 people with her. She arrived at 7:40 with a man and a woman in the back of the Buick. The man was Marcus Rivera, 46 years old, forensic accountant out of Chicago, formerly with the Department of Justice, currently in private practice. He was thin, dark-haired, soft-spoken, and he carried a leather satchel that he set on my kitchen table with the care of a man who has carried other men's lives inside satchels before. The woman was Dr. Eleanor Park, 52, neurologist at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Korean-American, raised in Chicago, residency at Johns Hopkins. Ruth had known her mother-in-law school in 1976. Dr. Park had driven down from Rochester on a Sunday evening because Ruth had called her at 4 in the afternoon and said the words, "I need a favor I cannot put in writing." I poured 4 cups of coffee. I put out a plate of bread and butter, because Margaret had taught me that you do not invite people into your kitchen and offer them nothing. And then I sat down at the head of the table, and I laid the 3 documents in front of them, and I told them everything. I told them about the FedEx envelope, about the forged will and the 50-year lease, and the doctor's letter signed by a man I had never met. I told them about Carla at Daisy's, and the envelope inside the Bible, and the $12,000. I told them about the parable of the rich fool. I told them about Ethan in my yard that afternoon, and the way his hand had twitched toward his phone. When I finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Marcus Rivera spoke first. "Mr. Holloway, may I ask what you do with your monthly bank statements?" "File them." "For how many years back?" "All of them. The ones from the 80s are in a box in the cellar." He almost smiled. "That will save us a great deal of time." "Doctor." Park spoke next. She had not touched her coffee. "Mr. Holloway, I would like to schedule you for a full cognitive evaluation at the clinic. MMSE, MOCA, neuropsychological battery. MRI if we can fit it in. I want a complete baseline on the record, signed by me, dated, and witnessed. The sooner the better." "How soon?" "Tuesday, day after tomorrow. I can clear the morning." "I'll be there." Ruth Calloway set down her cup. "Frank, before we go any further, I need you to understand something. What we are about to do is not a defense. A defense waits for the other side to swing. What you have asked us into is an offense. We are going to let your son believe he is winning, all the way up to the moment he is not. Do you understand the difference?" "I understand. It will require you to lie to him, repeatedly, for weeks, including at family meals." "I understand. It will also require you to lie, by omission, to your daughter, Hannah." I had been waiting for that one. I set my coffee down. "Ruth, Hannah cannot be told. Not yet. She does not have the face for it. She loves her brother. And she would not be able to sit across from him at Thanksgiving and pretend she did not know what we know. If Ethan sees one wrong look on her face, the whole thing comes apart." "Agreed," Ruth said. "But you understand what it costs her. She is going to spend the next 11 weeks believing her father may be losing his mind, because that is what her brother is going to tell her, and you are going to let her believe it." I looked at the table. I thought about my daughter, 36 years old, divorced, 2 years, working as the herd manager at a dairy operation 40 miles north, the only one of my 2 children who had ever bothered to learn the difference between alfalfa and clover. "I know what it costs her," I said. "I will make it right at Thanksgiving. Not before." Ruth nodded once. Marcus opened his satchel and took out a yellow legal pad. He uncapped a pen. "Mr. Holloway, I am going to need access to your business accounts at Cedar Hollow State Bank, your personal accounts, your tax returns going back 10 years, the articles of incorporation for the farm, and I am going to need the name of every entity your son has worked for since he left college, every address he has lived at, and every spouse, business partner, or LLC he has been attached to. I will run all of it through 3 databases by Wednesday morning. By Friday, I will know more about your son's finances than your son does." "What are you looking for?" He looked up from the pad. "Mr. Holloway, a man does not forge his father's will for 800 acres of Iowa farmland unless he is already drowning in something. I am looking for the something." They left at 10:40. Ruth was the last out the door. She stopped on the porch and turned. "Frank, one more thing. The doctor who signed that letter, Marcus Feldman of West Des Moines." "Yes, I had a clerk look him up on the way over. He surrendered his medical license in 2019 for Medicare fraud." She let that sit. "Whoever recruited him for this," she said, was not careful, which means whoever recruited him was in a hurry. She walked to the Buick. I stood on the porch and watched the tail lights disappear into the dark. Somewhere in Manhattan, my son was on a phone, talking very fast to people who had been in a hurry. I went inside and locked the door for the first time in 9 years. Marcus Rivera called me on Friday morning at 6:52. "Mr. Holloway, I have what I needed. Can Judge Calloway and I come to the farm this afternoon? I would prefer not to discuss this over a phone line." 2:00, I said. "Come hungry." I roasted a chicken. Margaret had a rule that bad news goes down easier with a hot meal, and I've kept her rule for 32 years. They arrived at 1:58. Marcus carried the same leather satchel, but it was thicker this time. He set it on the table next to the platter, and he ate 3 pieces of chicken and 2 helpings of green beans before he opened it, because he is a man who was raised right. Then he wiped his hands on a paper napkin, and he laid out what he had found. "Mr. Holloway, your son Ethan is in serious financial trouble, the kind of trouble a man does not climb out of by working harder." He turned the first page toward me, a spreadsheet, columns of dates and dollar amounts in red and black. "As of last Friday, your son owes a combined $2,340,000 across 4 creditors. The largest is a private bridge loan from a fund in Greenwich, dated March of this year, $890,000 at 14% interest. The collateral on that loan is listed as family agricultural real estate. Iowa, 800 acres. Free and clear." I set my fork down. "He pledged my land, on a loan I never signed for." "He pledged your land," Marcus said, "on a loan secured by a will that does not yet legally exist. The lender accepted it because Ethan provided a notarized letter of intent and a copy of the will dated August 19th. He has been operating, since at least March, on the assumption that the will would become real before the loan came due." "When does it come due?" Marcus looked at me over his reading glasses. "December 15th, 3 weeks after Thanksgiving." Ruth Calloway, sitting across from me, did not move a muscle. She had already known. She had wanted me to hear it from Marcus. "There is more," Marcus said. He turned another page. "Vanessa Holloway is Vice President of Investor Relations at Cromwell Agri-Industrial Holdings, the same Cromwell named on the 50-year lease." I figured. Cromwell is currently in the final stages of a merger with a Brazilian agribusiness conglomerate called Verde Norte. The deal is valued at $1.2 billion. It is scheduled to close on December the 8th. A week before the loan comes due? A week before the loan comes due. When that merger closes, Cromwell stock is projected, by the 3 analysts who cover it, to rise between 38 and 46%. I looked at the spreadsheet. I looked at the chicken bones on the platter. I looked at Marcus. How much Cromwell stock does my son own, personally? None. But in the last 14 weeks, an account at Charles Schwab in the name of Holloway Family Trust has purchased 12,400 shares of Cromwell common stock at an average price of $67.18. Total position, $833,000. There is no Holloway Family Trust. There is now. It was filed in Delaware on June 2nd of this year. The trustee of record is your daughter Hannah. The kitchen went very still. I had been ready for many things that afternoon. I had not been ready for that. "Hannah does not know," I said. It was not a question. "Hannah does not know," Marcus agreed. The Schwab account was opened with a copy of her driver's license, her social security number, and a notarized signature that does not match the signature on her Iowa voter registration. Same forger. Almost certainly. Who did your will? Same slant. Same finger pressure. I sat with that for a long moment. Ethan had not just stolen from me. He had built a structure designed to put his sister in a federal prison if any of it ever came apart. The Cromwell shares, purchased on inside information about the Verde Norte merger by the Vice President of Investor Relations herself, would be the textbook definition of securities fraud, and the name on the account was Hannah Holloway, dairy herd manager, Cedar Hollow, Iowa. Not Ethan, not Vanessa. If the trade was ever questioned, my daughter would be the one the SEC came for. Marcus. Yes, Mr. Holloway. My son knew the merger was coming because his wife told him. Yes. His wife told him because she works at the company being acquired. Yes. And he opened an account in his sister's name, using a forged signature, to buy stock in his wife's company, on information his wife gave him, 3 months before the public announcement. Yes. That is a federal crime. That is several federal crimes. Mr. Holloway. Wire fraud. Identity theft. Insider trading under Rule 10b-5. Conspiracy. Each one carries between 5 and 20 years. Stacked. The exposure is roughly 47 years. Ruth finally spoke. Frank, the question now is not whether your son goes to prison. The question is whether your daughter goes with him. I stood up from the table. I walked to the kitchen window. The sun was low over the soybean field, the same field where Ethan had played as a 4-year-old with a plastic combine in the dirt. And I watched the wind move the leaves for a long time before I said anything. Ruth. Yes, Frank. I need you to find me a lawyer at the SEC, quietly. Someone who will listen, and who will not move on anything until I tell them to move. For when? For Thanksgiving morning. Not before. Not 1 minute before. She nodded once. And Hannah. I turned from the window. Hannah comes to the farm tomorrow. I'm going to lie to my daughter for the first time in her life, and I am going to do it to save her. Hannah arrived at 10 on Saturday morning with a casserole dish in her hands and worry in her eyes. She had heard things. Cedar Hollow is a small town, and a small town does not keep a secret for 3 weeks when a pastor is the one telling it. She had heard about the tractor I had not left running. She had heard about the birthday I had not forgotten. She had heard from a cousin who had heard it from a neighbor who had heard it from her hairdresser that her father was slipping. She set the casserole on the counter. She kissed me on the cheek, and she looked at me the way a daughter looks at a father. She is afraid she is starting to lose. Dad, sit down. We need to talk. I sat down. Hannah is 36 years old. She is tall like her mother and broad-shouldered like me, and she has the chapped, working hands of a woman who has pulled calves at 2 in the morning in February. She is divorced, no children, and she has not asked me for $1 in 15 years. She is the better of my 2 children. I have known this since she was 9 years old, and I have never said it out loud, because a parent does not say such things out loud. She pulled up the chair across from me. She folded her hands on the table. Dad, Ethan called me on Tuesday. He's worried about you. Is he? He says you've been forgetting things. He says Pastor Walsh is worried. He says some folks in town are worried. And he wants to bring out a specialist from Des Moines next week. Somebody who can do a proper assessment. He says if everything is fine, then everything is fine. And we'll all sleep better. I looked at my daughter. I looked at her chapped hands on my kitchen table. I looked at the casserole on the counter tuna noodle, the same recipe Margaret had made for 30 years. The recipe Hannah had learned from her mother at 11 years old, standing on a step stool in this same kitchen, and I told her the lie I had been preparing for 48 hours. Honey, I think your brother may be right. Her face did 3 things. Surprise, pain, and then a kind of brave stillness. The stillness of a grown daughter deciding, in real time, that she was going to be the strong one in the room. Dad, I have not wanted to say anything. I have been trying to manage it on my own. But there have been mornings. Hannah, mornings where I come down the stairs, and I cannot remember what day of the week it is until I look at the calendar. There was an afternoon last month, I do not remember which afternoon, where I sat in the truck in the co-op parking lot for 40 minutes before I could remember what I had driven there for. None of this was true. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her hand was warm and rough and steady. My hand, on the table, wasn't steady. I let it not be steady. A man who has farmed for 52 years can decide which parts of his body to control and which parts to release. The way he decides which row to mow and which row to leave for the pheasants. Daddy, why didn't you tell me? Because I was hoping it would pass. And because I did not want you to look at me the way you are looking at me right now. She squeezed my hand. There were tears in her eyes. Not falling. Hannah does not let tears fall in front of other people, but standing there, on the rim, waiting. I went on. Ethan's right. Sweetheart, I should see somebody. I am going up to Mayo on Tuesday. I already scheduled it. A neurologist your mother's old friend recommended. Whatever they find, and after the holidays, we'll sit down, you and me and your brother, and we'll talk about the farm, about what comes next, about what makes sense. After Thanksgiving. After Thanksgiving. I want one more Thanksgiving in this house. Hannah. Just one more. With the family around the table the way your mother would have wanted, before everything starts to change. Can you give me that? She nodded. She could not speak. And honey, one thing. Yes, Dad. Do not tell your brother about the Mayo appointment. He'll want to come. He'll want to drive me. He'll want to be in the room. I love your brother. But I need to hear what that doctor says by myself, without anyone in the room who has a stake in the answer. Can you understand that, yes, Dad, promise me. I promise. She stayed for lunch. She heated the casserole. We ate at the table where I had eaten with her mother for 38 years. And I asked her about the dairy operation, and she told me about a heifer that had twinned the week before, and about a new vet they had hired out of Wisconsin. And for 45 minutes, I was a father having lunch with his daughter. And it was the worst 45 minutes I had lived through since Margaret died. She left at 2:20. She hugged me at the truck. She held on a little longer than usual. And before she let go, she said the sentence that almost broke me. Daddy, whatever happens, I am going to take care of you. You don't have to be scared. I watched her drive down the gravel. I went back inside. I sat at the kitchen table, and I put my face in my hands. And for the first time since the FedEx envelope had appeared on my porch, I let myself cry. I cried for 8 minutes by the clock on the stove. Then I stood up. I washed my face at the kitchen sink. I picked up the phone, and I called Ruth Calloway. And I said 4 words. It is done. Move. I drove up to Rochester on Monday night and slept in a Holiday Inn on the south end of town. I have stayed in maybe 4 hotels in my adult life. Margaret used to say, I sleep in hotels the way a horse sleeps in a trailer standing up, with one eye open, ready to be home. That night, I did not sleep at all. I sat in the chair by the window. I watched the parking lot lights buzz on the wet pavement. And I thought about the day in 1993 when Margaret had first started forgetting words. She had been 45 years old, the word she could not find. That first afternoon was colander. She had stood at the kitchen sink with the strainer in her hand and looked at me and said, Frank, what do you call this thing? We had laughed about it. 6 months later, the doctor had told us it was not what we were both already afraid it was. It was ovarian cancer, and the forgetting was a symptom of something else entirely. But I had learned, that afternoon at the sink, what it felt like to watch a mind start to slip away from a body. And in the Holiday Inn parking lot at 3 a.m, I asked myself the only honest question a 70-year-old man can ask before a cognitive evaluation. What if Ethan is right? What if there had been mornings I did not remember? What if I had sat in the co-op parking lot? What if the only reason I did not believe I was slipping was that the slipping man is always the last to know? I sat with that question until the sun came up over Rochester. Then I shaved, I put on a clean shirt, and I drove to the clinic. Doctor. Eleanor Park met me in the lobby at 7:30. She did not smile at me. I appreciated that. A doctor who smiles at a patient before the test has already given the patient an answer. And the answer is usually wrong. She walked me through the testing room. She introduced me to a neuropsychologist named Dr. Acharya, who would administer the battery. She explained, in plain English, what each test measured. The MMSE was a basic screen orientation, recall, attention, language. The EMOCA was harder executive function, abstraction, delayed recall. The neuropsych battery would take 3.5 hours and measure things the first 2 tests could not catch. The MRI would happen at 1 o'clock. Mr. Holloway, she said, I want you to do something for me before we start. All right. I want you to tell me, in your own words, why you are here. I had been expecting a different first question. I sat with it. I am here, I finally said, because my son has filed a document with a doctor's signature on it, saying I am incompetent. I do not believe I am incompetent, but I have been a farmer for 52 years. Ma'am, and the first thing you learn on a farm is that a man's belief about a thing is not the same as the thing. I came here because I needed to know which one I was looking at. She wrote that down, word for word. Then she nodded once, and she handed me off to Dr. Acharya. I will not walk you through every test. I am not going to ask you to sit through 3.5 hours of subtracting 7s from 100 and remembering 5 words and copying a clock face with the hands at 10 past 11. I will tell you this. There is a test where they read you a list of 15 unrelated words, and you have to repeat back as many as you can remember. And then they do it again 4 more times to see how many you can accumulate. And then they wait 20 minutes and read you the list again with 20 extra words mixed in. And you have to pick out which ones were on the original list. I got 15 out of 15 on the recall. I got 15 out of 15 on the recognition. The young woman administering the test wrote the number down. And then she wrote it down a second time on a different sheet, the way a person does when she wants to make sure she has not made a clerical error. She looked up at me. Mr. Holloway, can I ask, how did you do that? I thought about it. Ma'am, I have been calving cows for 52 years. Every cow has a number. Every calf has a number. Every calf has a mother. And every mother has a sire. And every sire has a line. I have carried 400 head in my head every spring since 1973. 15 words is not very much. She wrote that down too. The results came back at 4:20 that afternoon. Dr. Park brought them into the consult room herself. She sat down across the small table from me, and she opened the folder. And for the first time that day, she allowed herself a small, professional smile. Mr. Holloway, your MMSE is 30 out of 30. Your MOCA is 28 out of 30. You lost 1 point on the cube drawing and 1 on the trail making, both within normal range and consistent with a man who has not held a pencil for office work in 50 years. Your neuropsych battery places you in the 94th percentile for your age cohort across every domain we tested. Your MRI shows age-appropriate cortical volume and no evidence of vascular disease, no white matter, hyperintensities of concern, no atrophy in the hippocampi or the temporal lobes. She closed the folder. In plain English, there is nothing wrong with your mind, Mr. Holloway. Nothing. I did not say anything for a moment. I had not realized, until she said the words, how much of me had been carrying the other possibility. Doctor, Park. Yes, Mr. Holloway. I would like a written report. Signed, dated. Notarized if your office can do it. 3 copies. You will have them by Friday. I stood up. I shook her hand. I drove home through the dark, past the soybean fields and the cornfields, and the small towns where the gas station lights were the only lights on. And I got back to the farm at 11:40. Hannah had left a note on the kitchen table. Daddy. Tom Brennan called. He says it is urgent. Please call him in the morning. Tom Brennan's law office sits above Pettigrew Hardware on Main Street, up a wooden staircase that has been creaking since 1946. I had climbed those stairs maybe 60 times in 31 years. I climbed them on Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock, with Dr. Park's preliminary letter in a manila envelope under my arm, and the 3 forged documents in another. Tom was waiting at the top of the stairs. He is 73. He wears the same brown cardigan he has worn since the late 90s. He shook my hand without smiling, and he led me past his secretary, a woman named Lorraine, who has known me since high school, and he closed the door of his inner office behind us. Frank, sit down. We have a problem. I sat down. On Friday afternoon, a process server from Des Moines delivered a petition to my office. A petition for emergency conservatorship, filed in Polk County by a firm called Whitfield, Crane and Associates, on behalf of one Ethan James Holloway, naming you as the respondent. The hearing is set for November the 17th, 8 days before Thanksgiving. The petition, Tom went on, is supported by a physician's affidavit from a doctor, Marcus Feldman, and by sworn statements from 3 witnesses attesting to a pattern of cognitive decline. The witnesses are listed as Ethan Holloway, Vanessa Holloway, and Reverend David Walsh of First Faith Methodist Church. I had been ready for 2 of those names, not the 3rd in writing. Tom, before we go further, I need you to read this. I slid Dr. Park's letter across the desk. He read it. He read it twice. When he looked up, the cardigan had not changed, but the man inside it had. 94th percentile, 94th percentile. He set the letter down very carefully. Frank, why did you not come to me 3 weeks ago? Because 3 weeks ago. Tom, I did not know which of my friends had been bought. I needed to know what I was looking at before I started telling people. He absorbed that. He did not argue. All right, then tell me what you are looking at now. I told him. The FedEx envelope, the forged will, the 50-year lease, Ruth Calloway, Marcus Rivera, the $2,340,000 in debt, the Cromwell shares, the Schwab account in Hannah's name, the Verde Norte merger, December the 8th, December the 15th, the hand twitched toward the phone in my yard, the $12,000 inside David Walsh's Bible. Tom listened without interrupting for 22 minutes. When I finished, he stood up. He walked to the window that looks down on Main Street. He stood there for a long time. Frank, yes, the will in my safe was last updated in 2016. 60% to Hannah, 40% to Ethan. Cemetery and farmhouse to Hannah outright. I want to change it. He turned from the window to what? 100% to Hannah. The land, the house, the cattle, the equipment, the cemetery. A separate trust of $200,000 to be administered by Ruth Calloway, payable to any grandchild of mine who reaches the age of 25 and has not been involved in a felony. Nothing to Ethan, nothing to Vanessa. A single sentence in the document. Tom, that I want read aloud at the reading. To my son, Ethan, who has chosen another inheritance. I leave the consequences of his choice. Tom wrote it down word for word. And Frank, the witnesses for the new will, they cannot be local. Not anyone in this county. Ethan's lawyers will challenge the witnesses first. Ruth said the same thing. She has 2 retired judges in Des Moines who will drive up Thursday. Then we signed Thursday, here in this office. Notarized by Lorraine, I will hold the original in the floor safe, and I will mail certified copies to 3 separate locations, including one to a firm in Minneapolis that has no connection to Iowa. Do it. He sat down again. He picked up Dr. Park's letter and tapped it against the desk. Frank, one more thing. The conservatorship hearing on November 17th. We are not going to fight it. I looked at him. We are going to let it proceed. We are going to let your son and his lawyers walk into that courtroom, believing they have a sleeping man on the other side of the aisle. And then, on the morning of Thanksgiving, 6 days later, we are going to drop everything on his head at once. The medical report, the forensic accounting, the forged will, the SEC referral, all of it. In your own dining room. He almost smiled. Frank, I have been your lawyer for 31 years. I have never enjoyed a case in my life. He paused. I am going to enjoy this one. I'm going to break my own rule for a moment. I have been telling you this story in the first person. From my kitchen, from my truck, from my pew. I have told you only what I saw with my own eyes and heard with my own ears. But there is a scene in this story that I did not witness, and that I learned about later, in pieces, from 3 separate sources: a doorman, a housekeeper, and a forensic record subpoenaed in January. I am going to tell it to you now, the way it was told to me, because you need to see what my son believed he had won. On the evening of November the 18th, the day after the conservatorship hearing in Polk County, the day after Tom Brennan stood up before the judge and offered no defense beyond a request for a continuance, Ethan and Vanessa Holloway held a dinner party in their apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. The apartment was on the 14th floor of a pre-war building on Park Avenue. 3 bedrooms, a formal dining room, a view of the reservoir. The rent, Marcus Rivera would later tell me, was $19,400 a month. There were 6 guests: Vanessa's parents, in from Greenwich, a managing director at the Greenwich Fund that held the $890,000 bridge loan, 2 senior partners from Whitfield, Crane and Associates, and a man named Charles Beaumont, the chief operating officer of Cromwell Agri-Industrial, who had flown in from Chicago that afternoon. The housekeeper served beef Wellington. There was a $2,000 bottle of Bordeaux. Vanessa was wearing a dress from a designer whose name I will not write because I had to ask Hannah how to spell it, and whose price I will not write because writing it would make me angry all over again. At some point during the second course, Ethan raised his glass. To my father, he said, who finally chose his family over his pride. The table laughed. Vanessa's father said, 42 years too late, but better than never. The table laughed again. The managing director from Greenwich said, when does the conservatorship finalize? December 1st. One of the Whitfield Crane partners answered, maybe December 3rd. The judge wants a status report from the court-appointed evaluator, but it's a formality. We have the Feldman affidavit. We have the church witness. The old man's own lawyer didn't even put up a fight. Charles Beaumont of Cromwell said, and the lease executes the moment the conservator is appointed. 50 years, $41 an acre. The conservator's first official act. Ethan, my son, my 4-year-old in a sleet storm, said the sentence that was reported back to me word for word by the housekeeper, who had paused in the doorway with a tray. He surrendered easier than I expected. I thought there'd be more fight in the old man. I want you to sit with that sentence for a minute. I have sat with it for a long time. I sat with it the first night I heard it, alone at my kitchen table. And I sat with it the morning I dictated it to the SEC attorney in St. Paul. And I'm sitting with it now as I tell it to you. There is a particular kind of grief that does not come from a child's cruelty. cruelty I had seen before in other men's children, and I had been ready for cruelty. What I had not been ready for was the boredom in my son's voice, the disappointment that the taking of his father's life work had not been more interesting, the casual way he set his father's resistance on the table next to the Bordeaux and found it lacking in vintage. My son had not hated me. Hatred would have honored me. My son had been underwhelmed by me. That was the sentence I carried into Thanksgiving morning. Not the forged will. Not the Cromwell shares. Not the $12,000 in David Walsh's Bible. That one sentence, spoken over beef Wellington on Park Avenue. I thought there'd be more fight in the old man. The housekeeper's name was Maria Delgado. She was 58 years old. She had worked for Ethan and Vanessa for 11 months. She had been raised on a small farm outside Ponce, Puerto Rico, by a grandfather who had taught her, she would later tell me, that the land remembers every man who ever lied on it. She had heard the sentence. She had finished serving the course. She had walked back to the kitchen, and she had picked up her phone, and she had called her cousin in Queens, who worked as a paralegal at a firm that sometimes did business with the Southern District of New York. The cousin had a friend. The friend made a phone call on Monday morning to a former colleague who had moved to the SEC's Enforcement Division in St. Paul. The former colleague at the SSEC, by the time the call came in, had already received a confidential file from a retired Iowa judge named Ruth Calloway, dated 3 weeks earlier, requesting that no action be taken on the contents until the morning of November the 26th, Thanksgiving Day. By Wednesday evening, the file in St. Paul had 3 independent corroborations, 2 sworn affidavits, and a name attached for the on-call agent. By Thursday at sunrise, the trap I had set in my own dining room was already closed. My son just did not know it yet. I woke up at 4:15 on Thursday, November the 26th. I had set no alarm. A farmer who has needed an alarm clock has already lost something. I lay in the dark for a moment, listening to the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the click of the furnace, the small sound of Cap shifting on his rug at the foot of the bed, and then I got up, and I dressed in the dark, and I went down to the kitchen. The turkey was a 22-pound bird, raised by a neighbor named Henry Voss, who had been delivering us a Thanksgiving turkey since 1991. I had put it in the brine on Tuesday night. I rinsed it now, patted it dry, rubbed the skin with butter and salt and sage from the herb garden Margaret had planted in 1979. And I put it in the oven at 5:10. Then I made coffee, and I went over the morning in my head, the way a man goes over a field before a hard rain. The guest list, as Hannah understood it, was small. Herself, her brother, and his wife, in from New York. Tom Brennan and his wife Edith, family friends of 30 years. And Pastor David Walsh, who had been invited at Ethan's specific request 3 weeks earlier. 8 people around the table. The guest list, as it actually stood that morning, was different. At 6:30, Ruth Calloway would arrive in the green Buick, accompanied by Dr. Eleanor Park, who had driven down from Rochester the night before and slept at Ruth's house in Des Moines. Ruth would carry a leather briefcase containing the original Mayo report, 3 notarized copies, and a sealed envelope from the Polk County Clerk's office that I had not yet seen the contents of. At 7, Marcus Rivera would arrive in a rental car from Cedar Rapids, carrying a second briefcase, this one containing the full forensic file bank statements, wire transfers, the Schwab account records, the Delaware trust filings, and a 41-page summary memo prepared for the SEC. At 7:30, 2 men in dark coats would arrive in an unmarked Ford sedan from St. Paul. One was Special Agent Daniel Reyes of the Securities and Exchange Commission, Enforcement Division. The other was an assistant United States attorney out of the Northern District of Iowa. They would park behind the machine shed, out of view from the house, and they would wait there in their car until I called them at 8. Sheriff Wendell Krause of Cedar Hollow County, whom I had known since he was 9 years old, and his father had been my neighbor, would arrive in a marked cruiser and park behind the corn crib. He would wait there with a deputy until I called him, and at 12:30, when the turkey came out of the oven and the family sat down to dinner, the trap I had been building for 81 days would have every one of its teeth in place, and every one of those teeth would be operated by a person who had already received written instructions from Tom Brennan's office about exactly when, and in what order, to walk through my front door. Hannah arrived at 9, as she had every Thanksgiving since the year her mother died. She came into the kitchen with a pie carrier in each hand, apple and pumpkin, the same 2 pies Margaret had made every year, baked from the same handwritten cards in the same recipe box on the same kitchen counter where my daughter now set them down. She kissed me on the cheek. She looked at me carefully. She had been looking at me carefully for 8 weeks. And I had let her. And I had lied to her with my face every time she did it. "How are you feeling, Dad?" "I'm feeling all right, sweetheart. You look tired." "I am tired. But it is a good morning. I am glad you are here." She watched me a moment longer. Then she turned to the counter and began rolling out the dough for the dinner rolls. She did not ask me about the Mayo appointment. She had not asked me about the Mayo appointment in 3 weeks. I think, by then, she had decided not to know the answer until I gave it to her, and I loved her for that. Ethan and Vanessa arrived at 10:45. He was wearing a navy blazer and slacks, the costume of a man who has decided his father needs to be reminded that the city is in town. She was in cream-colored cashmere and pearls. They carried a bottle of wine and a bouquet of flowers from a florist in Cedar Rapids, and they smiled the smiles of 2 people who had been told, by their attorneys, by their accountants, by the dinner guests in Manhattan, that the hard part was over. Ethan kissed his sister on the cheek. He shook my hand. He looked me in the eye. And he said the sentence he had probably rehearsed all the way from the airport. "Dad, it's good to be home." I smiled at him the way Ruth had taught me to smile 8 weeks earlier, in this same yard. "Son, I'm glad you came." Pastor Walsh arrived at 11. Alone. His wife was visiting her sister, he said. He had brought a card. The card said, in his handwriting, "Frank, whatever comes, we are with you." I put the card on the mantel, face out, where everyone would see it. The doorbell rang at 11:30. It was Ruth. Ruth came through the front door in a wool coat the color of dry corn husks, with Dr. Eleanor Park behind her. Ethan looked up from the couch. The smile he had been wearing for his sister slid sideways and did not quite recover. "Dad, who is this?" "Son, this is Judge Ruth Calloway. She was your mother's friend. And this is Dr. Eleanor Park, a neurologist at Mayo. They are joining us for Thanksgiving dinner." Vanessa stood up from the armchair very slowly. "Frank, I don't believe we were told there would be additional guests." "You were not." "Vanessa, it is my house. It is my table. I did not realize I needed your approval to set an extra plate." Ruth shook my hand the way a person shakes hands at a courthouse, not a holiday. She did not remove her coat. Dr. Park did not remove hers either. They sat together on the love seat, the briefcase upright between Ruth's boots, and they didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were. The doorbell rang again at 11:40. Marcus Rivera. Leather satchel. Gray suit. He introduced himself to Hannah as a friend of Judge Calloway's, in town for the holiday. Hannah, who knows people the way I know cattle, looked at his shoes, looked at his satchel, looked at her brother's face going pale across the room, and she did not say a word. She went back to the kitchen. She turned the heat down under the gravy. She came back to the doorway and stood there with a wooden spoon in her hand. And she watched. Pastor Walsh had gone very still on the dining room chair. Ethan stood up. "Dad, can I talk to you? In private. In the kitchen. After dinner, son, we are about to sit down." "Dad." "Ethan, sit down." He sat down. The turkey came out at 12:28. I carved it at the head of the table the way I have carved every turkey in this house for 41 years. Hannah brought the rolls and the gravy and the green bean casserole. Ruth and Dr. Park and Marcus sat on the side of the table nearest the window. Ethan and Vanessa and Pastor Walsh sat on the side nearest the wall. Tom Brennan and Edith sat at the foot. I said grace. I thanked the Lord for the harvest, and for the hands that had brought it in, and for the family he had given me, the one still at the table, and the one in the cemetery on the North Ridge. I did not editorialize. A man does not editorialize at grace. I sat down. I unfolded my napkin, and I picked up the small mason jar that had been sitting next to my water glass since the table was set. It was an old ball jar, quart size. The lid was new. Inside the jar were 3 folded sheets of paper and a small white envelope and a single dry corn kernel from the 1973 harvest that my father had given me the year he died. I had carried that kernel in my desk drawer for 46 years. I set the jar in the middle of the table, beside the gravy boat. "Before we eat," I said, "I want to do something my grandmother used to do at this table. She would pass a jar around at Thanksgiving, and each person would say one true thing about the year. One thing they were grateful for, or one thing they had learned. I would like us to do that this year. I will start." Vanessa's fork stopped halfway to her plate. "I am grateful," I said, "for the truth. And I have learned, this year, that the truth keeps better in a jar than a lie keeps in a Bible." The room did not move. I turned my face to Dr. Park. "Eleanor, would you go next?" "Doctor." Park set down her napkin. She reached into the briefcase at Ruth's feet. She took out a manila folder, and she opened it on the table beside her plate. "My name is Dr. Eleanor Park. I am a board-certified neurologist at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. On October the 13th of this year, I conducted a full neurological and neuropsychological evaluation of Mr. Franklin J. Holloway. The evaluation included an MMSE, on which he scored 30 out of 30, a MOCA, on which he scored 28 out of 30, a 4-hour neuropsychological battery, on which he placed in the 94th percentile for his age cohort across every domain measured, and an MRI of the brain, which showed no evidence of cognitive impairment, vascular disease, or neurodegenerative process of any kind. She turned the folder toward Ethan. "I have brought 3 notarized copies of the report. One for you, one for your attorney, one for the court." Pastor Walsh put his fork down. He had not yet picked up his knife. Vanessa's face had gone the color of the cream cashmere she was wearing. Ethan's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I picked up the carving fork. I picked up the knife. I set a slice of turkey on Hannah's plate, and then on Tom's plate, and then on Ruth's, and only then did I look at my son across the green bean casserole. Eat, son, I said. It is going to be a long meal. We ate in silence for 4 minutes. I counted. The only sound in the dining room was Edith Brennan's fork against her plate, because Edith is 71 years old and was raised by a mother who taught her that no matter what is happening at a table, a guest does not insult the cook by failing to eat the bird. She ate. The rest of us moved food around. At the 4-minute mark, I set down my fork. Marcus, would you go next, please? Marcus Rivera wiped his mouth with his napkin. He folded it. He laid it beside his plate. Then he reached into the leather satchel on the floor beside his chair and took out a single-bound document, perhaps 40 pages, with a blue cover. My name is Marcus Rivera. I am a forensic accountant. I was a senior auditor with the United States Department of Justice for 11 years before I entered private practice. Over the past 9 weeks, at the request of Mr. Holloway and Judge Calloway, I have conducted a full financial review of Ethan James Holloway, of Vanessa Holloway, of Cromwell Agri-Industrial Holdings, and of an entity called the Holloway Family Trust, registered in the state of Delaware on June 2nd of this year. Vanessa's hand moved toward her purse on the floor. Ruth Calloway, without looking at her, said one word. Don't! Vanessa stopped. Marcus opened the report to a page he had marked with a yellow sticky note. Mrs. Holloway, you are listed in public corporate filings as the Vice President of Investor Relations at Cromwell Agri-Industrial Holdings. In that capacity, you have had access, since at least March of this year, to material non-public information concerning a proposed merger between Cromwell and a Brazilian agribusiness conglomerate known as Verde Norte. That merger is scheduled to close on December the 8th. Are you aware of any of this so far? Mrs. Holloway, she did not answer. Between August the 11th and November the 3rd of this year, Marcus continued, an account at Charles Schwab, opened under the name of the Holloway Family Trust, purchased 12,400 shares of Cromwell common stock at an average price of $67.18 per share. Total position, $833,000. The trustee of record on that account is Hannah Marie Holloway of Cedar Hollow, Iowa. Hannah, in the kitchen doorway, took half a step forward. Marcus, she said. What did you just say? Marcus looked at me. I nodded. Miss Holloway, there is a brokerage account in your name, which you did not open, holding $833,000 in stock you did not buy. The signature card on file at Schwab carries a notarized signature attributed to you. It is a forgery. The same forger, based on slant and pressure analysis, who forged your father's will and the lease on this farm. The wooden spoon dropped out of my daughter's hand. It hit the floor with a sound that nobody at the table acknowledged. Marcus turned the page. Mr. Ethan Holloway. As of last Friday, you carry $2,340,000 in personal debt across 4 creditors. The largest is an $890,000 bridge loan from Carthage Bridge Capital of Greenwich, Connecticut. The collateral pledged on that loan is the 800 acres of Holloway Farms, free and clear, supported by a will dated August 19th of this year. That will is a forgery. The loan is therefore a fraud upon the lender. The loan comes due on December the 15th. He closed the report. At 10 o'clock yesterday morning, this document, in its full form, was filed with the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Iowa, and the New York State Banking Department. Filing was held under seal until 8 o'clock this morning, when the seal was lifted at the specific request of Mr. Franklin Holloway. He paused. It is now 12:46 in the afternoon. Pastor David Walsh stood up from the table. Frank, I think I should go. Sit down, David. He sat down. I turned to my son. His face was not pale anymore. His face was the color. A man's face turns when his blood has decided it does not know where to go and has stopped trying. He was looking at his sister. Not at me. Not at Vanessa. At Hannah in the doorway, with the spoon at her feet. He opened his mouth. Hannah, don't... It was my daughter's voice. I had not heard that voice from her since she was 11 years old, and a boy in her class had killed a barn cat with a rock. It was the same voice. Older. Steadier. Final. Don't say my name. Ethan. Not at this table. Not in this house. Not until I decide whether I'm ever going to let you say it again. She bent down. She picked up the spoon. She walked back into the kitchen. We heard the spoon hit the sink. We heard the water run. She did not come back out. I looked at Vanessa. Mrs. Holloway. There is a car parked behind my machine shed. Special Agent Reyes is going to want to speak with you before dessert. Special Agent Reyes came in through the back porch at 12:51. He was a tall man, maybe 50, in a charcoal coat with snow on the shoulders. He did not raise his voice. He showed his credentials to Vanessa. He asked her, courteously, to step into the front parlor for a brief conversation. She stood up. The pearls at her throat moved when she swallowed, and she walked out of the dining room ahead of him without looking at her husband. The parlor door closed. That left 7 of us at the table. Hannah was still in the kitchen, and the water was still running. I picked up the mason jar from the middle of the table. I unscrewed the lid. I took out the small white envelope. Ethan, I said, I want you to listen to me now, not as my lawyer's client, not as Vanessa's husband, as my son. Can you do that for me? He nodded. He could not speak. In February of 1989, you were 4 years old. You had pneumonia. The temperature outside was 11 below. The truck would not start. Your mother was driving back from Davenport in a sleet storm and would not be home for hours. I wrapped you in 3 blankets and the quilt your great-grandmother stitched in 1946. I carried you out to the old 4020. I drove you 41 miles to Cedar Rapids at 15 miles an hour, with my hand on your chest the whole way, feeling for your breath. I stopped. I had not meant to stop. I made myself go on. The doctor told me, in the waiting room, that another 2 hours and we would have lost you. I sat in those plastic chairs in my coveralls, smelling of diesel, and I made the Lord an offer. I said, Lord, take the farm, take the land, take everything I have. Just let me keep the boy. I looked at my son. The Lord let me keep the boy. And tonight, son, I am here to tell you that I have kept my end of that bargain. Whatever happens after today, whatever a federal judge decides, whatever your wife signs at that parlor table, I am not the one taking the farm from you. I never would have. You took it from yourself. Ethan's hand was over his mouth. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single page, the new will, signed 8 days earlier in Tom Brennan's office above the hardware store, witnessed by 2 retired judges from Polk County, notarized by Lorraine, sealed in red wax. I did not unfold it. I laid it flat on the table beside the gravy boat. Tom, read the relevant clause, please. Tom Brennan put on his reading glasses. He cleared his throat. Last will and testament of Franklin Joseph Holloway. Executed November the 18th, in the year of our Lord. Article 3. To my daughter. Hannah Marie Holloway. I devise and bequeath the entirety of Holloway Farms, comprising approximately 800 acres of real property in Cedar Hollow County, Iowa, together with the farmhouse, all outbuildings, all equipment, all livestock, and the family cemetery on the North Ridge, to be held by her in fee simple absolute. He turned the page. Article 4. To the issue of my children, if any, who attain the age of 25 years and have not been convicted of a felony, I establish a trust in the amount of $200,000 to be administered by Ruth Margaret Calloway as trustee. He turned the page. Article 5. To my son, Ethan James Holloway, who has chosen another inheritance. I leave the consequences of his choice. Tom closed the folder. The dining room was so quiet I could hear the furnace in the cellar. Pastor David Walsh, at the far end of the table, made a small sound in his throat. Not a word. The sound a man makes when he understands, finally, that the sermon he preached on the rich fool was not about a parable. It was about himself. I looked at Walsh. David, the two men you swore an affidavit for on the 17th of November will be receiving a separate filing on Monday morning from the Iowa Bar's Perjury Division. I am told the matter does not move quickly, but it does move. You will want to find a lawyer of your own. Not Tom. Tom is taken. I stood up from the table. I picked up the mason jar with the corn kernel still inside it. I walked into the kitchen. My daughter was standing at the sink with her back to the doorway. Her shoulders were shaking. The water was still running. I shut the tap. I set the jar on the counter beside her. I put my hand between her shoulder blades, where Margaret used to put her hand when one of the children had taken a hard fall. Hannah, she did not turn around. I lied to you, sweetheart. For 8 weeks, I lied to your face at this counter, and I lied to your face in this yard, and I lied to your face at this table. I did it because I could not protect you any other way. I am asking you to forgive me. Not today. Whenever you can. She turned around. She was not crying the way I had expected. She was crying the way her mother used to cry on the rare occasions her mother cried. Quiet, steady, with her whole face still working. Daddy, she said, you are the only one in this house who never had to ask. She put her arms around my neck, behind us, in the dining room. The parlor door opened. Special Agent Reyes was holding a pair of handcuffs. Hannah let go of my neck. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, the way she used to wipe her face after milking. She straightened her shoulders. Then she walked past me, back into the dining room, and she stood in the doorway with her arms folded. Because she had decided she was going to watch. I followed her out. Special Agent Reyes was standing in the dining room with the cuffs held at his side. Low, the way a man holds a tool he hopes not to use. Vanessa was beside him. Her face was no longer the color of cream cashmere. It was the color of skim milk. The color a face turns when the bones underneath have given up holding the muscles in their usual places. Mrs. Holloway, Reyes said, you have indicated to me that you are not willing to make a voluntary statement at this time. That is your right. Under the authority of a sealed warrant issued this morning by the United States District Court for the Northern District of Iowa, I am placing you under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit identity theft. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back. She turned around. She placed her hands behind her back. The pearls at her throat caught the light from the dining room chandelier as she moved. And I thought, very briefly, and without any pleasure, of the receipt Marcus Rivera had shown me 3 weeks earlier for the necklace. $18,000 at a jeweler in Greenwich, paid in March, on a card that drew from an account holding $2,400 at the time of purchase. The cuffs closed with a small sound, a click, no louder than the lid of the mason jar. Reyes read her the rights from a small card he carried in his coat. She did not look at her husband. She did not look at me. She looked at the bouquet of flowers she had brought from the florist in Cedar Rapids, sitting in a water glass on the sideboard because I had not given her a vase. And her eyes stayed on those flowers as Reyes walked her past the table and out the front door. The door closed behind them. We heard the car start in the drive. We heard it pull away. Ethan had not moved. Sheriff Wendell Krause came in through the kitchen door at 1:06. He took his hat off. He nodded to Hannah, whom he had known since she was in pigtails. And then he walked to the dining room and stopped behind Ethan's chair. "Ethan!" My son turned his head, slowly, the way a man turns his head underwater. "Son, there is a warrant for you, too. State of Iowa. Forgery in the first degree. 2 counts. Filing of false instruments. 3 counts. We can do this here at the table, or we can step outside on the porch. Your choice. Your dad asked me to give you the choice." Ethan looked at me. For the first time that day, his face was not calculating. It was not performing. It was the face of the 4-year-old in the back of the John Deere, looking up at me through the cab window, with his cheeks wet and his eyes wide, asking without words whether I was going to be able to fix this one. I could not fix this one. "The porch," I said. "Let him walk out under his own power. Wendell, he is still my son." Sheriff Krause nodded. Ethan stood up. His napkin slid off his lap onto the floor. And Hannah, without taking her arms from across her chest, said quietly, "Leave it." He left it. He walked out under his own power. The screen door slapped shut behind him. We heard a second car start. We heard it pull away. It was 1:12 in the afternoon. I sat back down at the head of the table. There was still half a turkey on the platter. Edith Brennan, God bless her, picked up her fork. "Frank," she said, "if you don't mind, I'd like another piece of the dark meat." I almost laughed. I almost cried. I did neither. I picked up the carving knife. Pastor David Walsh was still in his seat. He had not moved during any of it. His hands were flat on the table on either side of his plate, palms down, the way a man puts his hands when he is afraid that if he lifts them, they will shake. "Frank, David, I would like to leave now. You may leave when Ruth tells you it is appropriate to leave. David, not before. There is a deputy on my porch, and he has been asked to drive you home, because Ruth and I both feel you should not be operating a vehicle in your present condition. Your car will be returned to you tomorrow." He stood up. He did not look at any of us. He picked up his coat from the back of his chair, and he walked to the front door, where a young deputy I did not recognize was waiting with a courteous hand on the frame. The door closed. That left 6 of us at the table. Hannah finally sat down. She sat in the chair her brother had been sitting in. She picked up the napkin from the floor, folded it, and placed it on the table next to her plate. "Daddy," she said, "pass the green beans, please." I passed her the green beans. We finished the meal. I want you to understand that, because I have told you a hard story. And I would not blame you for thinking that nobody ate after the handcuffs. But we did. Edith had her second piece of dark meat. Tom had a second helping of the green bean casserole. Hannah cut the apple pie at the kitchen counter and brought it out one slice at a time, the way her mother used to, and we drank coffee from the percolator until almost 3 in the afternoon. Nobody mentioned my son. Nobody mentioned Vanessa. Nobody mentioned Pastor Walsh. We talked about Henry Voss's turkey. We talked about Edith's nephew, who had just been accepted to the veterinary school at Iowa State. We talked about the snow that was supposed to come in on Sunday night, and about whether Hannah's dairy operation had enough corn silage to get the herd through to February. We talked about the work, because the work, on a farm, is what is left when the noise stops. Ruth and Dr. Park drove back to Des Moines at 4. Marcus drove back to Cedar Rapids at 4:30. Tom and Edith left at 5, with leftovers wrapped in foil that Hannah had pressed into Edith's hands at the door. By 5:30, the house was empty except for me, my daughter, and the dog. Hannah stood at the sink, washing the good china by hand, the way her mother had insisted it be washed. She did not turn around when she spoke. "Daddy, are you going to be all right tonight?" "I am going to be all right, sweetheart. I can stay. I know you can. I'd like the house to myself tonight, if you don't mind. There is a thing I need to do at sunrise." She did not ask what. She finished the dishes. She dried her hands. She kissed me on the cheek the way she had at 10 in the morning, except that this time her hand stayed on my shoulder for a moment before she let go. "Sunrise," she said. "I'll be here at sunrise." She left. "I want to tell you about that morning. I was up at 4:15, the same time I had been up the morning before. The temperature outside was 16 degrees. The sky was clear. There was no wind. I made coffee. I put on the same coat I had worn every November for 9 years, and the same boots, and I called the dog, and I walked out to the North Ridge. The cemetery on the North Ridge is not large. 11 stones. My great-grandfather Josiah, who broke this ground with mules in 1891. My great-grandmother. My grandparents. My parents. 2 infant siblings of my father's, lost to influenza in the winter of 1918. A cousin killed in Korea. And Margaret. The empty space next to Margaret was the size and shape of me. I stood in front of her stone with the mason jar in my hand. I unscrewed the lid. I took out the corn kernel, the one my father had given me in the harvest of 1973, and I held it in the palm of my glove. A kernel of corn, if you keep it dry, will hold its life for a very long time. There are kernels in museums that have grown crops after 2,000 years. Life waits patiently for the right ground. My father had known that. His father had known that. And when my father had pressed that kernel into my hand in the fall of 1973, he had not said a word about it. He had just closed my fingers around it. And he had nodded once. And he had walked away. I knelt down beside Margaret's stone. The ground was frozen, but the dirt at the base of the maple tree was loose enough to take a finger. I pressed the kernel into that dirt. I covered it. I stood back up. It will not grow there. The maple shade is too deep, and the squirrels will find it before spring. I knew that when I planted it. That was not the point. The point was this: a man does not leave his land to the child who shares his blood. A man leaves his land to the child who has learned to kneel in front of it. I had been waiting 52 years to understand that sentence. And I had needed my own son to teach me, by failing, what my daughter had been teaching me, by working, since she was 9 years old. Hannah's truck pulled into the drive at 6:40. I heard the door close. I heard her boots on the gravel. I did not turn around. She came up the ridge in the cold, the same way her mother used to come, and she stood next to me in front of the stone, and she put her gloved hand inside the crook of my arm. "Daddy," she said, "what did you plant? The last harvest? Sweetheart." The sun came up over the corn stubble. If you have listened to this story all the way to the end, I want to say one thing to you before I go. You may have a child. You may have raised that child the best you knew how. And one morning, you may find an envelope on your porch that tells you the child you raised has become someone you no longer recognize. If that morning comes, I want you to remember an old farmer in Iowa. I want you to remember that the land you have built does not belong to the people who share your name. It belongs to the people who kneel in front of it. Choose carefully who you kneel beside, and whoever you choose, let them be the one who comes back at sunrise. If this story meant something to you, leave a word below. Tell me about the harvest you are protecting. I read every one. Goodbye for now. The sun is up, and there is work to do. Frank Holloway.